Very fortunate today. We have a very honored guest who has a long history of involvement with us. In fact, it might be Bob who is the basis of the name of the institute. Because when I was coming back from Oxford, Bob asked me to give a keynote address to the Positive Psychology Association, the International Positive Psychology Association, and I got quite intrigued with the positive psychology, and I said, when I came back, I said, well, why don't we use that to hang our hat on? It seems to cover a lot of what we're doing about, and from there it was history. And Bob, of course, had an appointment with us for a while, and has had all sorts of interactions with various people, and you can see his passion scale in various projects that we've been looking at. So he's already had a big impact, and it looks like he's taking the passion a little bit further into some new directions that will be quite intriguing, particularly for some of the PhD students who are using some of his older material to see where the new material is leading.
Thanks. Thank you, Herb. It's a real pleasure to be here. To see some friends and some new friends I can make during a visit. And like Herb said, when I chaired the World Congress in 2011, I invited him and he came give a great talk. And I guess one of the hope that you have as a chair, the way I organized, we have 20 invited speakers back in 2011. And it was divided by people, men and women, in North America and outside of North America. And you're trying to have people who will, the gatekeepers, who eventually go back home and pick up the message and do something with it. And I guess certainly Herb and later on Rhonda did a great thing. I like the new facilities, my God. Obviously, I don't feel as much, should I say, religion around here as the other place, but but it's certainly a great place. We've been doing a lot of stuff. I'm going to be focusing on one tiny little part of our new research, which deals with persistence. I've been saying for years in the model that persistence is important. There's different types of persistence, and we never had any data to back it up. So now we'll look at that. So all right, let's get started. So before I start, yes, to Tanya, who is now professor in education in the University of Sherbrooke, and Jay Werner Filio, who did the stuff on fictionism and passion that I talked about with someone before. Both of them in the Faculty of Education, one in Sherbrooke and the other one in Quebec at Outaouais. All right. Now, when we talk about persistence, these are some of the things that we see. Never give up. Crawl if you need to. Keep going. It sounds like a Chris Lonsdale message that he has on the. Or again, I failed over and over. Don't give up, and at some point you will succeed. And it's true that if you do persist, at some point good things will happen to you. At the same time, we knew people who do persist and look like this. So persistence at some point might be a downside to it. And if you persist on this term paper or this book you're working on and you neglect other aspects of your life, well, things like this may happen at some point. Obviously nobody's gone through this. Good for you, but I have. So, this is something that can create aspect in your other aspect of your life besides your work life. So what is persistence? Well, obviously, this is a dictionary that says that, going on resolutely or stubbornly in spite of opposition, opportunity, or warning, so keep it going no matter what. And when you look at, persistence in the psychological literature, most of it deals with intensity, right? To McDougall's, you have a goal, and you keep going, and in fact, it's part of the definition of the outcomes you have of motivation, right? So you persist. Choice, direction, persistence, intensity. Typically, it's used as an outcome. Do I intend to persist, for instance, in my schooling? Will I keep going? Or it's a mediator of achievement. You persist and then you have grades or so on. And you may have heard of this measure or this scale, grit perhaps, which is, we can go forever to talk about it, but because it compounds the two, passion and persistence. And it is a trait, so apparently you can be gritty for just about everything, I've never been greedy about taking the garbage out, but that's another story. So I guess, and reflects intensity. But also some people have been talking about, you know, the quality of that persistence. Brent Statter, or back in '90, but more recently talked about assimilation and accommodation of goals, which means that, you know, if I feel I can reach those goals, I will assimilate them and pursue them. But if I feel that I may not be able to do that, I will accommodate and maybe downscale the goals, or even, you know, just forget about the goals. Carson Rush from Montreal, from Columbia University, talked about pursuing versus letting go of goals. And if you let go of some goals that are unachievable, it could be good for you. But obviously, if you let go of goals, if you disengage, this is not persistence as such. If you keep going, it is, but if you stop, then it's something else. And I want to talk a little bit about rigid and flexible persistence, which are the two kinds of, you know, persistence I want to present to you today. And one is, you know, you keep going no matter what, and that's the only thing that counts for you. And the other one is more flexible, where you keep going, you don't let it go, but then you can go back, leave it, take care of other stuff in your life. So if you take the example of a major review paper you're working on a grant, for instance, right? This is your goal, right? You have this plate, this is your review paper, keep going, don't drop it, you have a deadline, don't drop it. And you can either incorporate it in your life so that it is there, but other stuff counts as well and you don't drop those plates. Or it's the middle plate, and the other one, well, you know, they're shaky. So you persist, but you're so rigid that you may suffer elsewhere in your life. Whereas if the second one, if for instance, if you have a more flexible kind of approach to it, to persistence, you keep going, but still other stuff matter, and you keep going in these other goals as well. And at some point, we've heard about, you know, broken plates and everything. So what are some of the determinants? One determinant we've been focusing on is passion. And you may have heard about the model. If not, I'll just present it very quickly. It's basically, passion for us is a strong inclination toward a self-defining activity, object, person. It could be a belief. Like in Quebec, we got some movement, you know, toward the independence of Quebec. That's a belief, ideology. Very, not as strong as it used to, but still with some people. And you love, value, and spend some time on a regular basis in this activity. So it's not a trait. You know, passion can never be a trait because you cannot be passionate about everything. So there might be a couple of things in your life that you're passionate about. It is self-defining. At some point, it becomes part of your identity. So I don't play basketball. I am a basketball player, and Phil is certainly a fan about cricket and maybe playing cricket. So that will define him. And you love the activity. It's important to you. Spend time. And so that's your basic definition. But there are two types of passion, harmonious and obsessive, depending on how it's been internalized in your identity. And with harmonious passion, you have this strong inclination toward the activity, but it remains under your control. And you can choose when not to engage in the activity or not. And the way it's been internalized, it provides access to a lot of self-adaptive processes. For instance, like mindfulness and so on, and different types of self and emotional regulation, James Gross regulation. And it's in harmony with other aspects of your life and leads to positive emotions. I say flexible persistence, and that's what we're talking about today, and self-growth. With obsessive passion, eventually the activity comes to control you. So if you hear about this activity and you're working on something, that's it, you may be gone. You'll think about it, or you can go and do it. And it doesn't provide you with as much access to adaptive self-processes. Mostly it will be ego involvement that will be triggered. And it will lead to conflict with other aspects of your life and create negative consequences, emotional consequences, and limited self-growth. So there is some self-growth, you know, because you're passionate about something, you love something, you'll work on it, you'll get better. So there will be self-growth, but it tends to be constrained to this area of your life that you kind of focus on because you're passionate. And the other stuff, the other areas of your life, you won't experience as much growth. So these two aspects are important, you know, the harmonious and obsessive. And some of the findings that now there are over 500 studies from different labs. So initially it was mostly coming from our lab, now it's exploding everywhere. And this is kind of interesting that there is a high prevalence. Most people are at least moderately passionate for something in their life. Now we're pursuing the 15–20% who are non-passionate, so we're looking at that, but most people are. And because it happens in people's lives, so we've looked at painters and athletes and so on, and nurses, musicians, different cultures across the lifespan. We've validated, and with her we'll look at the invariance also, and Phil as well, of the passion scale. And now it's been validated in over 15 different languages, so it's kind of cool. We can also have people either in the lab or even online and use some induction. So if we know people are passionate for something, then we can induce, harmonious or obsessive, and people behave during that session as if they were, harmoniously or obsessively passionate. Different designs, different measures, objective measures, and even informants in some studies, peer reports, and so on. So this is for those who haven't seen the scales. It's on the 7-point scale, 6 items for each. I have a tough time controlling my urge to do this activity. I also have an obsessive feeling for the activity. And with harmonious passion, this activity is harmony with other activities in my life. So this is summary of the book. We were very happy that it got the AP award for Book of the Year a couple of years back. And this one just came out. This is related to the book Passion for Work with Oxford. All right, so present research, looking at the 2 types of persistence. So our main hypothesis was that with harmonious will trigger, the flexible kind of persistence that you want to have, and obsessive passion will trigger the more rigid form of persistence. And it makes sense, because if you're obsessive about something, this is the main thing that counts for you. Whereas with harmonious passion, you should be able to engage other stuff that is important to you in your life. I must admit, we're not sure about some minor hypotheses. For instance, what about obsessive passion and flexible persistence? What kind of relationship should we get there? And you'll see we got some we replicate the same kind of findings where there's a negative relationship. Now, if you're harmoniously passionate and you can choose what to do with your activity, can you choose maybe to be rigid sometime and engage on this thing, although you may suffer, and you'll see that we have some results that tend to suggest that as well. All right. So study 1, we start validating the persistence scale and look at the relationship with the 2 types of passion. So we had over 1,000 participants. This was passion for work. And we randomly split the sample in 2, 1A, 1B. 1A, we did a EFA, exploratory factor analysis, on the persistence scale that we reduced down to 8 items, 4 per subscale. And then with sample 1B, we did a CFA, and then we did additional analyses with the whole sample. So these are examples of the rigid persistence scale. I'm willing to do anything to reach the top at work. When it comes to reaching my goals at work, nothing else matters. With flexible persistence, I work hard on my work goals, but other things matter as well. And I work hard to achieve a work goal, but can stop if necessary. So there's this flexibility to go and go back, stop, go back, and so on. This is the EFA. So we have 4 for rigid persistence. I'm willing to do anything to reach it. I'll mention those. It's okay for me to focus only on work goals in order to succeed, to let go of some things in life in order to excel at work. So they give you some kind of sense of the psychological nature of that subscale. And the other one, the last one is very telling, I think. I'm trying to reach my work goals, but not at the expense of other life goals. So people keep on persisting. It's not like the rush subscale where you disengage permanently from goals. You keep going, but you have this flexibility. So this is with sample 1B. So you got the CFA. There was the statistics were very good, and then so we replicate those results from the EFA and show that it's independent from harmonious and obsessive passion. And then we had this looking at the hypothesis, the relationship between passion and the two types of persistence. So with harmonious passion, it predicts flexible persistence, and you get this negative relationship with, obsessive passion, minus 0.30 with flexible persistence. Now looking at rigid persistence, so you get 0.54 from obsessive passion to rigid persistence, and you do have 0.13 with harmonious passion and rigid persistence. It means that from time to time, people may engage in this, but their main way of doing things is the flexible persistence, which is kind of cool. So this is a paper that we're just finishing up for GPSB with Tanya and Jay. So basically, the support for two types of persistence and passion as a determinant of the two types of persistence. All right, so now we want to replicate these findings in another kind of activity, so with leisure activities instead of work. And we'll want to test the model again, including now some outcomes. So the outcomes should come from persistence. So persistence should act as a mediator and looking at some activity that activity outcomes that you would experience. And obviously want to control for grit, because grit is one of the variable that's out there, but we want to control statistically for that. So we have people engage in this activity, leisure activity, so they have the scale, persistence scale, and look at satisfaction and flow while engaging in this leisure activity. So again, we've got controlling for grit statistically. Okay, so the same kind of findings, 0.44 minus 0.13 with respect to flexible persistence. With rigid persistence, same kind of findings. Obsessive passion is a main determinant. And now looking at outcomes, main predictor of flow is flexible persistence, and this is controlling for grit. And you get some effects from rigid persistence that is significant. And satisfaction in the activity, again, the main predictor is flexible persistence, but you do get something from rigid persistence. So you do get something in the activity that is a bit lower, with respect to the importance of the beta weight. So you get something from rigid persistence, but the main contributor is flexible persistence, and this is controlling for grit. So you got the same kind of replicate the effect of passion with respect to persistence, and look at both rigid and flexible persistence predict those activity outcomes, and controlling for grit. Now study 3, we want to replicate the same kind of relationship, and we want to look at obstacles, because that's one of the things that, when you're passionate, you persist, it allows you to overcome obstacles in your dancing. That's the kind of people we had there. And looking at also an outcome that would be outside of the activity. Now here the main hypothesis is that both types of persistence will give you something. Overcoming the obstacle will be one important outcome that you will derive from both types of persistence. But the kicker effect is that flexible persistence should give you this energy, this vitality thing, using the Vallerand and Friedrich scale, that you don't get from rigid persistence. So these were dancers engaged in different types of dancing. So we have passion scale, persistence scale, questionnaire on obstacles in dancing, and the vitality scale. So again, the same basic findings that we get. You get a positive relationship from harmonious passion to flexible persistence, but negative effect from obsessive passion. Again, rigid persistence is being predicted by obsessive passion, mainly, and a little bit by harmonious passion. Now, in terms of the activity outcomes, both of the type of persistence will allow you to overcome obstacles in dance. But this is something that, and you see rigid persistence, 0.39, 0.24, these are not statistically significant. People may see something there, maybe there is, we'll need to replicate those findings. But when you look at vitality, only flexible persistence will give you that. So there is something you get outside of dancing, and it only comes with a flexible persistence. You don't get it from rigid persistence. All right, so again, we replicate those findings with respect to the determinants of persistence and the activity outcomes, but only flexible persistence predicts vitality outside of the activity. Now the last study basically wanted to replicate the whole thing with perspective, using a perspective design, looking at changes in outcomes. We use a 6-month perspective design, looking at changes in both life and activity outcomes. So we had participants who were, now this time we asked them to indicate the favorite activity. And then they named the activity, the time they spent in this activity, and passion scale, persistence scale, and the outcomes. We use a short thriving scale by Ed Diener, and the performance scale from the optimal functioning in society scale that we were just about ready to submit, and looking at both time points. So again, the same basic findings with respect to flexible persistence, same kind of finding with respect to rigid persistence, the two types of passion there. And this is we use the residuals, score, so that rigid persistence predicts, and flexible persistence predict the residuals in performance and activity over time. But only flexible persistence predict changes in thriving in life over time.
Did you control for time 1?
Yeah, well, there's residuals from time 1, time 2.
Yeah.
So that's controlling for time 1. So that's why I have the residual score there. Because of the number of participants, this SEM comes messy with time 1 of measures and everything, so we use the residual scores.
Is there time, there's not time on persistence though, is there?
I'm sorry?
There's not time on persistence, is there?
Time 1,
Persistence?
no, what time, persistence was at time 2.
It was not measured at what time?
No, we didn't have it at time. All right, so to summarize and give time for questions, basically we've got these two types of persistence that are kind of interesting because they give you different types of outcomes. People might say, well, I'm suffering because I can't let go of this thing. Maybe there's another way of doing things. And that would be a flexible persistence. And we have a scale now that's pretty solid that we can use. And the role that passion plays, I think, is kind of interesting. You can actually have your cake and eat it too. You can do well. You can excel. We followed people around for years, even people who become professional hockey players. But they have a different way of doing things. They have a harmonious passion for their craft, and while pursuing the dream, they're happy, whereas it's not the case with obsessive passion. And that kind of persistence, we believe, is important in that regard. And it leads to, you would get the activity outcomes, right? This is pretty clear. Both types of persistence will give you the outcomes in the activity. It depends on what your life goals are. If you want to excel in sport or academia and that's it, or if you want to have additional, outcomes as well, then your passion, harmonious passion, and flexible persistence is very, very important to keep in mind. And like I said, it is triggered by the type of passion you have. And I don't have the time to get into some of the other stuff we've done recently, published, I think, 2017, and more recent stuff on the determinants of passion, because how do you get the harmonious passion? It's something else we can discuss if you have questions, but that's also interesting. So kind of future research that we're into right now, using experimental design not to look at the causality effect, so inducing harmonious or obsessive to look at the type of persistence. Also, what is flexible persistence in people's life? Is it, I start working on my goals much earlier and then I keep going, or I say, okay, divide time differently, or we need to find out through diary studies how people do that, so that's kind of cool. Looking at other outcomes, objective performance and health and so on. And looking at the potential downside of flexible persistence. There are times when being too flexible might come and bite you from behind. I missed the deadlines, I blew it. Too flexible. So that kind of thing is important to look at as well. And there might be upsides to rigid persistence. And one indication we have of that is that consistent, low but still consistent positive relationship from harmonious passion to rigid persistence. There is something that you do get, and maybe something you do get, you do have to get into rigid persistence. It makes sense. We have to submit a grant, have to do this, and sometimes you do. But then if you're Flexible, you are reorganized for a little while, maybe your life, so that everybody knows around you what you're doing, and they're not asking you questions of what the hell's going on. That's it. So it's just something new, and I'm looking for questions, comments, and so on, because, you know, there's this gap, like there was gap in SDT years ago with, you know, when one of my students asked me, when Evelyn asked me, he said, Bob, is it possible that loving an activity, loving something is bad for you? Because there's not one study in the literature that shows that intrinsic motivation leads to negative outcome. But we do know that people suffer when we love something. That led us on the path to obsessive passion and dualistic model of passion. And I think there's also a gap with respect to persistence. You know, people say just persist or disengage. Well, there's a huge gap there. So, yes, Herb.
You sort of finesse the causal ordering.
Oh, finesse.
Your model sort of assumes that passion leads to persistence.
Yeah.
And that and both of those lead to outcome.
Yeah.
But it seems to me to make sense that I get passionate about something that I'm doing, and so that there's some sort of reciprocal sort of relationship over time.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about the persistence. I would think that there would be a reciprocal effect there as well.
Yeah.
And so trying to tease out some of that causal ordering with some of the longitudinal kinds of things.
That's a good point. Maybe try to come up with an answer to those questions. First, we've done several studies using cross-like panel design, passion and outcomes. And out of those 12 studies, I would say most of them, if not all of them, passion leads to outcomes. Very rarely do you find the other way around. So passion leads to outcomes. That's great, including experimental design. Passion and persistence, I could see people persisting at some point, say, hey, I'm getting good at this, and you know, I think I developed some passion. But that's why study 4, we had a 6-month lag between passion and persistence. Obviously, in that study, it leads in one direction, and we cannot, you know, do it the other way around. So, but it could be that, yeah, reciprocal, right? Certainly can live with that.
Well, at some level, I have to have an activity before I can get passionate about it. So at some level, the activity has to come first.
Yeah, you have to engage in it, and at some point it becomes part of you, and so on. Yeah. You have to keep going, and yeah, that makes sense. Yes?
I'm interested in two things you alluded to.
Okay, wow.
One, the qualities that you've learned about the passionless.
Yes.
And two, the predictors of harmonious and obsessive passion.
Okay, let's start with the predictors of passion. What we find is that it's kind of interesting. We've got 4 studies in the General Personality paper, and people with the, you know, with the 2 types of passion, you do get something from the activity. And we look at need satisfaction, so the SDT kind of perspective. With harmonious passion, you know, what it drives those things is that you do get the activity need satisfaction. And we distinguish between the 2 types of need satisfaction, which is something which is, I think, something new from SDT. Typically, people say need satisfaction, and we say there are 2 types. The one you derive from engaging in the activity, and you know, so need satisfaction from the activity, you get both with harmonious and obsessive, but much more with harmonious. But the other one, which is very important, and explains why people become obsessive, is what happens in the rest of your life. So need satisfaction in your life. And what we find is that there's a huge negative relationship between need satisfaction in your life and obsessive passion. It is compensatory in nature. People don't get anything in their life but in this activity, so the little need satisfaction they get counts for a lot. They don't get it elsewhere. We've got 4 studies, including one using an experimental design that shows that it triggers obsessive passion. So that's so you do get something from it, but not as much as with harmonious passion. But you're in there because, see, when Bob Dylan, you know, was followed around by some of his fans and said, Bob, we've been to 100 of your shows. You know what he said? Get a life. You're obsessive about following him around, and he says, get a life. That's pretty much what we get. So the implication, you know, from either clinical or applied, is that a lot of people, when I give talks, and ask me about, you know, if they're life coaches or something, how can I change that obsessive passion? usually say, don't touch it. It may be the only thing that's going for this individual. First, learn about the individual, what's happening in his or her life, and try to add something in their life. They're going to have a fun activity or something with the spouse or whatever. A fun activity, the obsessivity will subside eventually. So don't touch it right away, unless it's life-threatening or whatever. So, and the first question was?
The passionless, so you call them non-passionate.
Oh, okay. What we find is that we get about 20-25%. So we tested thousands of people out. There's people, there were several hundreds that were non-passionate. And what we find is that they feel guilty when they experience pleasure, as if they don't allow themselves to look for pleasure in their life. And there's not much difference in terms of, the big 5 personality variables. But that's one thing that we were surprised. So now we got this huge study where we want to follow people over time. And we got some preliminary data. We got maybe like 50 people, and we're still pursuing these people, but 50 people who actually, during the course of a year, managed to find either their passion back or they find something. And then their well-being is higher than it was before. So there is something about, about having a passion, in your life. In fact, one of the ideas was it the Beck Depression Inventory that says, have you lost interest for stuff you used to, to engage in your life or something? Mm-hmm. That's kind of cool that clinicians will get that kind of item in there, because that's basically what we find. Mm-hmm. So they're not as happy, and they don't allow themselves to look for pleasure. Mm-hmm. So there is something interesting there. Now, we don't know, we need to pursue that, if these people, because you need to tease that out there very carefully, if they had a passion before and lost it, or never had a passion in their life. Because I would assume there would be some differences there. Okay. Yes, Paul?
I'm wondering about the role of context, I guess. Like, I'm thinking about why I've persisted in things. It's largely been because of social context. But, I've joined a committee, and then I got into the kayaking in a big way, and I kept on doing it and so forth. And
that's a very good point.
So, where does that fit in this?
It plays a big part in terms of determining, because we internalize both types of passion inside. It's never 100% harmonious or 100% obsessive, right? So we've got both. And they are, when I give the address at the World Congress, I think I identified something like 25 studies dealing with different types of determinant, and social context is key. We know, supervisors or coaches can push the right button to drive you crazy and you become obsessive or being harmonious. Social context is the same way. If people, you look at, if you don't perform well one day, they look at you, what's wrong with you today? The message is pretty clear. Over here, we perform. So you put the obsessivity.
I wasn't so much thinking about passion as a mediator of that, but more just the direct effect of persistence, of availability of social reinforcers.
Yeah. That can play a big key as well. We haven't controlled for that in our studies, but yeah, it could affect persistence directly. Yeah, sure, for sure. Yeah.
That sounds like the engagement is driven by the group rather than the activity, though. Almost like the activity is interchangeable.
Yeah, no, but if I was reporting on Bob's survey, you wouldn't be able to tell that.
Yeah.
You'd be just responding.
But you're right. If there's a deadline,
yeah,
right? But it could be that for a while you're going to be rigid. Rigid persistence, right? If there's a deadline, grant, whatever. So I can see that. Could be influenced by that. But we wanted to be specific to this situation as well as the activity, right? So it's not a trait. So we wanted to be able to capture those kind of things going on too. So that's also important. Now, there was another,
There was a letting go element in some of the persistence items that reminded me of some of the items in Valgender's non-attachment scale.
Okay.
And so I wondered if you looked at non-attachment and or mindfulness as a trait predictor of different types of passion.
No,
right?
that's something that I guess we'll talk later. No, we haven't. It's but we do know that harmonious passion predicts mindfulness and so on. So
is it the other way around too?
Well, it depends how you would define it, either as a trait or a way of engaging.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Is passion not? Don't you find consistency across time within people of passion, even if they switch passions?
Depends passion for what. It depends. We'll always define passion for a given activity, right? So work or,
But then it's a continuum, so people are highly passionate about kayaking, and if
Yes.
that person switched to martial arts, would they be highly passionate about that?
we don't know.
I mean, it occurs, I suspect that would be it, because you're describing the opposite of it as people who feel guilty and ashamed about feeling pleasure. That
But
would
these
be
were
a
the
trait.
non-passionate people, right?
But that would be a trait. That would be pretty close to neuroticism.
We don't know if it's a trait or the situation they're in. At any given point in time, we do find 20%.
But that would load on neuroticism and negative affectivity.
Well, we've just published a paper last year on the Big Five and the facets and the 2 types of passion and everything. So that's something that.
What was, I assume that neuroticism loads on the obsessive
Yep,
compulsive.
but around plus 0.30 or something. So not huge variance, but still there. And some of the facets, in that direction as well. So.
But can't somebody stay passionate for their entire life about a single thing?
Yep, we got one guy who's been playing cards for 90 years. 100
Sounds
years of age.
trait-like. I mean, you know what I mean? I'm not seeing the states.
It depends how you define trait, right? If a trait is that you keep, being engaged the same way for one activity, which to me is not a trait, but if you define it this way, then yeah, get people mostly stable. But we do find people that when we push on the right button and use the experimental induction, they go around.
Yeah.
So it's I'm not sure about a trait.
Like, I mean, maybe the whole state trait thing is fishy because you could do that with extroversion too. You could push the right buttons and make people more outgoing or more.
Right.
So maybe that whole distinction is.
What
crazy.
Ben Schellenberg at Manitoba has found though is that some people are harmoniously passionate for some activity, but obsessively passionate for others. So there is this.
Okay.
So
That
that's
domain specific.
yeah.
Specificity.
And it depends sometimes how you get started in a given activity is also important, because Ben was telling me that, for basketball he's very harmonious, but some other activities he's not. And he said, when I started playing basketball with friends, it was great and everything. But this other activity, he had failed at something, he wanted to redeem himself, and he started the activity in a certain way to be ego involved and led to obsessive passion about it. So I guess the conditions you start something may stay with you. Just like Michael Jordan, who actually, I'm not sure if you know this, but Michael, first time he tried out for his varsity team, he got cut. So he didn't make the team. Did he come back with a vengeance? Don't dare to say against especially Cleveland, but that's something else. Couldn't happen. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
There's a lot of trauma around
So
that.
yes.
One of the things that we've been playing with is Marcus's, Phil and I, we've been working with you have a dichotomy of non-passion. So you have basically a threshold model.
Yeah.
And that assumes that there's something fairly dramatic that happens just below the threshold and just above the threshold. Now, we don't have good data because we're using the principal data, the school principals, and they're pretty passionate mostly.
Okay.
But we didn't find any evidence of a threshold.
Right,
There was a continuum.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, how hard have you pushed that threshold?
We haven't pushed that hard, and in fact, right now we're slowly moving away from it in the sense that, we're in a paper that, again, with Ben Schellenberg and other people, we're looking at the quadrants. So we use continuous data throughout, so instead of like this kind of threshold, and so we have people who are high, low, high, etc., and low, that would be the non-passionate people. So we're using statistics now to predict different types of outcome, and paper came out in Journal Personality, was it this year or last year? And so we look at well-being and health outcomes. And there are some nuances, but typically, the more positive outcomes come when you're high on harmonious and low on obsessive. That's the basic finding. But some of them also, if you're high, as long as harmonious passion is high, you may be protected on some outcomes. Health, I think, physical health was one variable. But then some variables, the lows are not doing very well, so that we the non-passion. So we're using these kind of statistics now, using this.
Is that a mixture model?
I'll have to go back. I think it might be, but
Variable center?
Either are at the variable level, not at the clusters of the person level, but the variable level.
So how would you know if there was a threshold?
Well, what we were arguing was that the logic of the threshold, I hate threshold, I don't believe in them. but the logic of the threshold says that there's a dramatic change in outcome just below the threshold and just above the threshold. And if it's a smooth continuum,
Oh, so you look at the
then
distribution.
that would, and we're sort of looking at whether it's actually possible to have no passion. You know, if you're alive, you have some level of passion. Another thing that was interesting, you got into the issue of domain specificity. So in our self-concept stuff, we have this internal-external frame of reference model, and so there's the math versus verbal play off, so there's an ipsative sort of thing. And I would assume that even more so with the passion, that there's an ipsative sort of thing, so that high passion on something means that there's low passion on something else.
I'm not sure if it works in that direction, but rarely will you find people who are passionate about, you know, like 4 or 5 things. There's not enough room in your life for, you know, being passionate about, you know, those numbers.
Well, that's the kind of ipsative sort of logic.
But the ipsative is not, are you harmonious across or in some other, you know, where are you passionate in your life? Well, we just finished, you know, 5 studies, series of 5 studies, and we tested huge numbers, like in some studies over 2,500 people. Who's the happiest? And we look at people's life across, you know, if they're passionate about their work, about relationships, friends, romantic relationships, leisure, and so on. And we find that the happiest people, the upper quartile, are people who have a harmonious, high level of harmonious passion across. You know, they're passionate everywhere. And I said, and one of those studies, you know, we asked them. I said, maybe they're crazy people, right? They're passionate about everything. So I said, okay, let's look at chores. So we look at their passion for chores, and they're not passionate for that at all. But their, you know, their motivation is more autonomous. So it's kind of cool. So we're pursuing in that direction now. But very rarely, most people, the people are unhappy or non-passionate, nothing in their life. And most people are in between, you know, the happy group and the other group. So it's kind of cool to flip it around and look at people and see what's happening in their life, which for me is going back to the hierarchical model kind of thing, looking at domain and looking at people instead of just activity for people. And which has a lot of implications, right? Applied implications, because if you're a teacher, or if you're a clinician of some sort, and then you want to find out why is this person unhappy at work, well, you have to look at the person and not just the work line. You have to go beyond that. So that's why we use, you know, some of these other variables to look at determinants and so on. Joseph?
Just thinking, and Pete did this thing where she looked at like 6 domains of behavior that produce well-being.
Right.
Well-being. And I was just thinking how the work could be unified, because if you did a diary study, right, you could look at people for whom when they engage in one, the other ones go down, versus other people when they engage in one, they're more connected with their family and more. Like, it seems like you could maybe derive harmonious passion from day to day.
Yes, that's very interesting. Yes, those diary studies, you know, we can do so much with those studies. It's just creativity, I guess, has to be there, and obviously the number of items that people can complete.
Could you have just like 5 domains, and how satisfied were you with this domain today? And then if you have, like, let's say over 30 days, and some people there's like negative relationships.
Yes, that's our study 5 in the package that I mentioned. Who's the happiest? And that's our study 5.
Okay.
Yeah, that's those.
So 2 years behind.
Well, you know,
catching up.
Well, you don't. This was not published yet. This is unpublished material I'm talking about here, so you're not behind at all. So.
Chris has a question.
Yes,
I'm
please.
just being polite, you know. Keep passing me over.
Thanks so much. So you got the elbow to ask a question, because, you know.
So, thinking forward to interventions, which you alluded to before. So if we sort of believe that rigid persistence is something that's probably not going to lead to great outcomes, depending on...
Well, it depends what kind of outcomes you want, right?
Depending on what you value in terms of outcomes, but certain things.
Yeah.
If we wanted to sort of intervene, do you think that the sort of the levers that you want to pull would be about trying to intervene and change people's type of passion? Or do you think it would be some sort of awareness raising intervention in which you made people more aware of their type of persistence they were pursuing?
Yeah.
Or some combination of the two, or something else?
Yeah, I guess I'll use the Donald Meichenbaum answer to this. It's Meichenbaum said there's different ways you can get in, to a client. There's the affect, there's the cognition, there's the behavior, and it may vary from person to person. So you may have to be flexible yourself, as in your interventions. Some people, relate very well in doing things differently, and then they realize they actually can do it. There's something very powerful in social psychology about behavior. That's why some therapists may ask people to engage in certain behaviors. I can do it. And suddenly they can and say, oh my God, it's a brand new world. I can do it. So people may believe that they only have to focus on certain issues, paper, work, whatever. And once they realize they can actually do two things during the same day, they say, oh, wow. So I don't have a definite answer for you. It may depend on the individual. But clearly, being able to do things differently leads you on a flexible path. That may be a nice way of doing things. Yes?
Your thinking is very similar, I think, to implementation engagement.
Goldwitzer stuff, yeah.
Yeah, Goldwitzer. He started off, his original concept was very rigid, dogmatic, goes to the grind.
Yeah.
And I felt like he got pressure to expand to flexible persistence.
And some people did it for him. Also, people, doing research will be using his model, and then, like Rich Kessler at McGill.
I actually thought that was a mistake when he lost the rigidness, the no distractions, things like that. Right. Because his focus was on goal attainment. There was an end. There was an end. Like passion is not really an end.
Not really. No. The engagement, the activity, and the way you engage. Yeah.
So I think the rigid persistence is great for goals, especially short-term goals.
Right.
But maybe you need a concept bigger than persistence with passion.
Yeah, well, also, you have to take into consideration that the persistence could be defined in months, weeks, months, years also. So I remember working with the Canadian, the women, Canadian national team, the water polo team, and how they were behaving very differently and within the same team. Some women were highly obsessive, but still did not experience conflict, and everything was fine. I said, what? I'm curious. Why? How's it going with the boyfriend? Oh, we dumped the boyfriend. Okay. Are you working? No, we're not working. Okay, we're living 5 to an apartment, and the only thing we think about is this. And when I told them that some of their teammates were doing things differently, I said, really? Same team, same goal. So information without pressure sometimes can go a long way in having people reflect and say, tell me more, and then you can move on. So I think that it's, for me, I think these two types of persistence can give you quite a bit. Now, in terms of at some point, it could be down the road, maybe in some occasion you need to be extra, maybe rigid at some point, finish the deal, close the deal, and then that's it. It could be. But what we found is that the flexibility and rigidity actually can do pretty well, and you get a bonus effect, a kicker effect with flexibility. Yes.
Hi. Yeah, I'm Marcus.
You are Marcus.
That's me. Yeah, so a big portion of my PhD is on passion.
Excellent choice.
And you spoke about the determinants of passion just prior. I recall when you initially made the scale, you included a lot of items with passion just in general. So just
the criteria.
Yes.
Yes.
Yet those aren't included before looking at the actual results.
Typically we don't. Because most of the time, not all of the time, but most of the time we take people who are really passionate. Because although we check it, we don't put them in the moment.
So if you're looking at the determinants of passion, did you look at just the manifestations of passion, or did you consider them being the same?
Well, we're starting doing some I'm going to share with you what we're doing right now in Montreal. We're starting to look at some maybe second order factor kind of thing, or maybe there's a general factor of passion that with some of the variables involved will trigger down to harmonious and obsessive that leads on. So we're looking at incorporating this, but we haven't published anything with that so far. You know what I'm saying? So that the criteria are, if you call it general literature, the manifestation you use, or so those kind of general items that the last 5 items we use, like I love this activity, I engage in it often, it's important to me, it's part of my identity and so on. These 5 items, you know, there will be like general kind of passion that leads to 2 types of harmonious and obsessive, but then with some other variables that trigger the different types of passion. So the interrelation process that will be different from economy support. So that will be kind of thing that we're looking at right now. But we started looking at the old data that we did for the, you know, the 2013 passion scale stuff. So we're looking at those 3,500 people.
Yeah, well,
What's your take on it? What do you think?
well, I included the passion criteria as
Yes.
where it was talking about instead of looking at economy, including that as an issue.
Right.
And looking at the antecedents,
Yeah.
you know, we did find distinct differences within the work context. The higher like quantitative demands would lead to higher obsessive passion, but wouldn't affect the others.
Right.
Whereas higher hours would lead to less harmonious passion, and then there would also be that opportunities for development would lead to just genuine passion, but wouldn't affect the manifestations.
Right.
So,
When's the
yeah.
manifestation? That's the outcomes or?
Harmonious passion versus obsessive passion.
Okay.
So if you include that third category, just the general views,
Right.
making it relate from those items
Yeah.
to the criteria, you can see those distinct differences.
Have you seen the paper that we, on resources and demand that we published back in 2014, I think, with Claude Fernet from True? So we got a paper, where was it published? Stress and anxiety or something? So we got a paper with, I think it was it features of nurses? So we have resources and demand and passion, so it would be interesting to look at because you're looking at those variable things. We can jump in.
Yes.
All right, good.
Well, great, it's wonderful. And
Well,
thank you very much.